This is an initial examination of the poem The Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew. Now, as ever, there is an awful lot to say about these poems, so if you're particularly interested in one of them or want to take it further, do start looking on the internet for good, reliable, deeper analysis of it. This video is intended to be a first pass through to enable you to start considering the ideas and writing about not only the imagery, but also the form and structure in a way that would help you either explore it in an essay for your essay writing skills and critical appreciation, or potentially if you were looking at it for GCSE. So if we look at the poem, I don't propose to read it out loud, but make sure you've taken the time before launching into this video to really read it and try and read it out loud to yourself, no matter how silly you may feel, just so you get a feeling of the rhyme scheme, the rhythm and the voice of the speaker. Now, I'm going to annotate in blue, and the purpose of this annotation, or I'm going to add any annotation in blue, the purpose of this annotation is to make sure that you've got a sound set of notes on the poem, you understand the meaning and you've started to understand the symbolism. In order to write about it, you have to take the next step in terms of collecting your thoughts and ideas together. So looking at it first of all from a title perspective, and when you're going into a poem, it's always good to stop and have a look at the title and see what expectations it's creating for the rest of the poem. Now here we have the title The Farmer's Bride, and we realise that the speaker is the farmer. So first of all, we're going to say about the title, we've got two roles here, and the characters in this poem are a little bit defined by their roles. The farmer's priorities are being a farmer, not being a husband. Okay, the bride's role is viewed as a bride. She needs to be his wife. The problem is that she is exercising an independence that he does not believe in, and society does not believe at this point she's allowed to have. So you have this title which defines our two major characters, including our speaker, by their roles. It also has more than an element of possession in it. The bride belongs to the father, and therein lies one of the main conflicts or the main issues in the poem. Now, next thing up, this idea of distinguish your speaker and your poet. This is not an autobiographical poem. Charlotte Mew is not a farmer writing about his wife. If you were interested in Charlotte Mew and the readings that her background and her beliefs, her politics bring to the poem, then please do look into Charlotte Mew's background, because that really does give you a couple of additional layers of a kind of psychological analysis of the poem. But we're not going to look at that today. So our opening stanza says, 3 summers since I chose a maid, too young maybe, but more's to do at harvest time than bide and woo. So we have first person dramatic monologue, and we're hearing from one character. The bride does not have a voice in this. We're hearing from the farmer, and we're hearing from him in his roles as farmer and husband, but he is predominantly farmer. He says that he chose this bride or this maid almost in the same way you would choose your animal stock, and the idea that he chose gives him that air of control. He knows that she's too young, too young maybe, and then that caesura, that dash in the middle of the line, quickly overrides any human concerns for practical concerns. There's more to do at harvest time than bide and woo. I've got better things to be doing with my time than to be catering to the needs of some young girl who I want to marry. So establishing the farmer's voice, beliefs, priorities is done quickly within those first 3 lines. You've also got, and I'll come back to this later, the idea of her as a maid. Okay, so you've got the idea of her as an innocent young girl who has not had any physical relationship with a man. And then instantly, when us was wed, she turned afraid of love and me and all things human. Like the shut of a winter day, her smile went out, and 'twasn't a woman, more like a little frightened fay. So you can explore the idea of the threat as soon as the relationship is legitimized in the eyes of marriage, the Christian church. He becomes a threat because that then sanctions their physical relationship. It gives permission for that. And he is expecting her to go from a maid to a woman, this idea of this coming of age. But she isn't a woman, she's more like a little frightened fairy. She is a mystery to him. The idea of winter in this simile shows that kind of coldness she feels to him, or the coldness he perceives coming from her. And later on, that fits in with the imagery of the Christmas coming, the berries ripening. He wants winter and Christmas to be a time of kind of coziness and cheer and berries ripening, fertility. She's closing everything down. And you get the idea of his character through his use of dialect and Muse use of colloquial, informal language. This idea of she runned away, 'twasn't a woman. So she actually kind of tries to leave. She runs away. Fall, you can look at the connotations of that. We now generally associate it with an American word for autumn, but it wasn't always the American word for autumn. We did used to use it in England. So it's not out of place. I'm obviously referring to fall of the leaves or so. There might be an argument you want to make for fall being a loss of innocence. If you think of the fall in terms of Adam and Eve, this is again, this idea of her maid to womanhood, innocence to experience, kind of loss of innocence. And throughout this poem, you get a lot of links between the bride and nature. There's a lot of comparisons with the animal world and their relationship. And look at all the things that the bride is compared to during the course of the poem and how that affects the presentation of her. So what after she's run away, out among the sheep her be, they said, should properly have been abed. There's an awful lot of judgment in those lines. You've got the kind of judgmental they, which we assume is the rest of the village, who are all complying with that idea of this kind of patriarchal control, the idea that a man controls his wife, a father controls his daughters, etc. And they all seem to know best. She should properly have been in the house. She should properly have been in bed. She runs to nature. She runs to the sheep. When he checks, she's not there, lying awake with her wide brown stare. So his perception of her earlier is she lies in bed with her eyes wide open, just kind of waiting, just scared, almost described in animalistic terms, that idea of, animals having their eyes wide open when they're frightened, big brown eyes of the animal. And then the way that she's talked about adds to that perception. We chased her, flying like a hare before our lanterns. So the idea, who is the we? Okay, we chased her, we caught her. This is a society which is against this young girl. She flies like a hare, again, that idea of energy, nature, etc. She's caught in a shiver and a scare, so she is reacting as if she's a frightened animal. The idea that she's got to Churchtown might be quite ironic because there's nothing Christian about the way that they're treating her. And once they find her, they fetch her home. They kind of court her, fetch her home, take her home at last, finally, and turn the key upon her fast. And you have that rhyming couplet at the end of that stanza, really kind of emphasising the decision there. And also the play upon fast. They did it quickly and they did it securely. Okay, so you get fast meaning those two things there. And the idea as well, context-wise, that, a man was entitled to lock his wife up. This is what, he's expected to do, because you can't have your wife running away around the countryside. Now, the tense then changes in the next stanza, and it might be that if you're comparing this to another poem, you want to look at the use of tense change as a device used by the respective poets. But we flick now to the current situation. She does the work about the house as well as most, but like a mouse. So she fulfills her domestic expectations during the day. But again, we have this natural comparison. She's like a mouse. So she's almost been reduced from the hare to the mouse. She seems to be shrinking in those similes. And then again, she's happy enough to chat and play with birds and rabbits such as they, so long as menfolk keep away. So there is a clear division or distinction. She is happy with the natural world, but not with the male element, the threat that men represent. And this purported direct speech is interesting because this isn't her saying it. He thinks this is her voice. He's presenting this as her voice to us. But in effect, the bride in the poem is voiceless. We don't actually hear her speak. This is what he thinks her eyes are saying, and beseech means to kind of beg or plead. So he can understand that she's really scared of him and really scared of men and what they represent. So not near, her eyes beseech when one of us, one of the men, comes within reach. Because, this idea of grabbing her, I guess. So he can kind of think about what she's feeling. There's some degree of empathy, but not enough for him to kind of understand it. And then it moves on to the women say that beasts in stall. So the beasts in the stall, the kind of animals in the sheds, and the cattle in the kind of, I can't remember what the word is, in the sheds will do. They look round like children at her call, so they relate to her. But then he says in a tone of some bitterness at his exclusion, I've hardly heard her speak at all. So the animals, she calls them, they all respond to her. She doesn't say anything to me. And you get that kind of triplet of full rhyme showing his mounting frustration. He then moves on to repeated use of similes, or Mew uses similes repeatedly. And remember, if you're writing an essay, it's repeatedly, not repetitively. Okay, repetitively has connotations of something being dull and boring, whereas repeatedly means neutrally that it's done over and over again. So the repeated use of similes, each one relates to the natural world. So as shy as a leveret, young, energetic, a leveret is a baby hare. So young, energetic, vulnerable, belongs in the countryside, quick to run away, easily spooked. Straight and slight as a young larch tree. So a young larch tree is very, very slim trunked. So she is slender. This is, again, this reminder that she's not fully mature. Her body hasn't filled out to be a woman. She's a young girl. And she's sweet as the first wild violet. So there's that idea of kind of, I suppose, sweetness, attraction, beauty, delicacy. Maybe kind of, that idea of not quite rarity, because in the countryside you do get these violets, but that kind of welcome beauty. And she's all of these things to her wild self, but what to me? And it's interesting, a couple of things there. You can comment on the sibilance here, maybe creating a sense of feminine softness and charm. You can talk about the way that Mew has left this word she isolated at the end of a line, possibly to indicate her isolation. The idea that she is true to her wild self. She is this kind of natural force that he is trying to domesticate. He's trying to tame or bend to his will. And she wants to be, her wild, her natural self. And the use of the question here really does start to show how disconcerted, how unsure he is that these roles that are traditional structures of society are breaking down in his case. What is she to him? She is not doing what she's meant to be doing. Okay? There is a dichotomy, a tension between her being true to herself and her fulfilling her role as wife. She can't do both, apparently. Then we get the idea that time is passing through this imagery, and yet another kind of winter is starting to set in. And, the lights is dulling, the trees are brown, the blue smoke, so it's getting colder because there's smoke coming out of the chimneys. We've got a little bit of kind of pathetic fallacy going on there. as things are starting to kind of draw in. Okay, maybe a sense of almost claustrophobia, things kind of drawing in, things focusing down into what's going on in this house. You can say, there's a loss of hope in this image, possible kind of unluckiness in terms of magpies, and things freezing. Okay, we've had that emotional coldness in terms of her smile shutting down like a winter's day. And yet the images in the farmer's head are one of kind of ripeness, kind of it's Christmas time. What's Christmas without there be some other in the house than we? He is looking at the practical side of marriage. He wants children. And of course, if his wife won't come near him, he's not going to be able to have children. And he's, ever practical. There's more at harvest time to do than bide and woo. He's thinking, what's the point of having a wife if she doesn't provide you with children? And then that brings him right to this present moment. She sleeps up in the attic there, alone, poor maid, 'tis but a stair betwixt us. So we get this impression again, sort of tense, the immediacy of that present tense at the end. We are drawn into being with the speaker, drawn into being with the farmer as he's waiting at the bottom of the stairs. So, she's sleeping up in the attic, she's alone. She begins and ends the poem as a maid. Okay, and that's, potentially significant for how the poem ends. You have this kind of line break here and here. Mew is using these line breaks to show her vulnerability. She's just there. She's alone. Okay, so that line break emphasizes her isolation. There's just a stair between us. Again, this is an obstacle that he can overcome potentially. And then he starts with these exclamations. They are monosyllabic, so one syllable. Okay. And if you look at the notes at the bottom, this fragmentation and disjointed nature of his language starts to show the growing frustration he's feeling, along with the exclamations. And he's now almost thinking of her in terms of animalistic imagery, and also kind of that gives rise to this sense of his instinctive reaction to her. He's thinking of her softness, her appeal, her attraction, and she's just over there. And all of these frustrations, all of these years of kind of not being able to be with his wife physically are maybe building up at the end of the poem. So you're left with this sense of tension and wondering what's going to happen next as he contemplates whether or not really he can control himself before going upstairs to her. Looking at the form and structure, if we go down to this corner, there is a rhyme scheme throughout the poem, and that regularity of rhyme scheme kind of gives that sense of drive and inevitability and pace to the poem. We're driving to this moment where he's downstairs wondering what to do. Okay, we get the distinct impression he's going to go upstairs maybe and attack her. And so that driving forward by both the regular rhythm and the rhyme scheme. The poem's mostly written in iambic tetrameter, and you can argue that the rhyme scheme kind of almost traps her and traps the farmer as well in these same patterns, these same frustrations. And the question is whether by the end, with the repetition, the monosyllables, the fragmentation, whether he's about to kind of break out of that pattern, break out of that existence. Now, a good question to study for this would be to ask yourself, how does the writer, so how does Mew present the farmer and his wife in this poem? Because that would allow you to do a good solid essay which explores both characters, both from an imagery and a form and structure perspective. If you're watching this for GCSE, then obviously you've got to compare it with another poem. The comparison that I would possibly go for automatically would be Porphyria's Lover, because you have these two dramatic monologues by obsessional, kind of driven emotionally, kind of not quite stable male speakers. And so these notes may lead to that comparison. Okay, I hope you found this useful. Bye now.